Wall Street Journal editorial board slamming allegations that senior officials discussed trying to get rid of President Trump, writing, quote, "The 25th Amendment was passed after JFK's assassination to allow for a transfer of power when the president is unable to discharge his duties. It doesn't exist to settle political differences or to let scheming bureaucrats imagine they are saving the country from someone they fear is a Manchurian candidate. The constitutional process for that is impeachment." Let's bring in Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard Law professor emeritus, and he is also the author of The Case Against the Democratic House Impeaching Trump, making you the perfect guest to ask this very question to, sir. So what do you think of the Wall Street Journal's assessment of what McCabe and the others in that room were ostensibly doing there with the 25th Amendment?
Well, not only do I completely agree with it, I have a piece today on the Hill that talks about a gaping hole in the Constitution. We have impeachment on the one hand, if you've committed a high crime and misdemeanor. We have the 25th Amendment on the other hand, if you are unable to govern, if you've been shot or if you've had a stroke. But in the middle, there's this large area that the Constitution doesn't deal with. And what McCabe was basically saying is they were trying to fill the gap. They were trying to stretch the 25th Amendment, because that might be easier to invoke, because all you need is cabinet members first, and then you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress. But it would be utterly unconstitutional to do that, and it would be wrong as a matter of law and a matter of policy. So the Wall Street Journal is right on point with their editorial.
I'm interested, though, how do you define that gap in the middle? I mean, what do you mean? That's if you want to remove the president, if what?
Well, let's assume he's just doing a terrible, terrible job. He never shows up. He doesn't nominate anybody. He goes to the gym every day. He's capable of governing. He's very smart, but he just won't do the work. He won't appoint ambassadors. He won't meet with anybody. That person shouldn't be the president, but he can't be impeached because he hasn't committed a crime, and he can't be removed because he's not incompetent under the 25th Amendment. The framers consider this. Somebody raised at the Constitutional Convention a criteria for impeachment: malpractice or failure to do duty. They rejected it. They said that would give Congress too much power.
Yeah.
So we need to fill that gap, or if we're going to keep it unfilled, the one thing we can't do is stretch the words of the Constitution to cover conduct that's not covered. The framers wanted every single member of Congress to take an oath of office to obey the Constitution. You can't obey the Constitution by disregarding it.
But isn't the middle ground there, Professor Dershowitz? Don't you vote the guy out of office or woman next time around? I mean, if they're going to the gym every day and they're not doing the job, it seems like the remedy's built in there. It's the ballot box. It's all of us.
Of course, and in my article, I talk about a president who runs first term, says, I'm not going to run a second term, so there's nothing you can do. You have to just tolerate me for the next 3.5 years. What would really happen under those circumstances? I suspect that Congress would stretch the words of the Constitution, either to impeach or to remove. They wouldn't accept a 3-year presidency in which the president does nothing. Of course, you can defeat him at the polls. You can defeat his party at the midterms. That's done all the time. But you may need an extreme remedy in an extreme case. Can I make one comment, though, about the wall? There's an interesting point that was made previously, and that is, if the president, in fact, already has $2 billion available to him to start building the wall, then there's no emergency. That very fact undercuts the claim of emergency. Let the president start spending the $2 billion. Let him start building the wall. It'll take months, obviously, to use up the $2 billion. At that point, he can go to Congress. He can make his argument. He can make his points. But to argue that it's an emergency when he already has $2 billion available to spend seems very much to me like a stretch. And I think the key point is going to be not how these courts rule ultimately, but whether they grant a stay. If they grant a stay, that will mean they don't think it's an emergency. And if they don't grant the stay, it'll be appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will either grant the stay or not, and that will tip their hand as to how they're going to ultimately decide this important case.
Given that point of view, you know, we were discussing in the last hour that it seems like maybe what this declaring an emergency, since it is just that smaller piece of money, is about keeping the fight public and keeping it in court and keeping it top of mind and kind of continuing the fight out loud as the building goes on. Does that strategy potentially make sense to you, given the analysis you just gave us?
Well, it's a political strategy that makes sense, but it probably may not fit into the criteria of the statute. In fact, I was at breakfast this morning with a member of Congress, and they're considering the possibility of maybe passing legislation that would restrict the president's power under the old 1970-something statute, saying you can't invoke an emergency when Congress has already made a decision. Emergency is something that you can invoke when there's not enough time for Congress to act. If there's a terrorist attack, if there's an invasion, if there's a flood, a natural disaster. But if you have time to bring a matter to Congress, it's hard to make the case that that constitutes an emergency under the statute. But the statute is written very broadly. So under the current statute, he may very well win in the Supreme Court.
Yeah. All right, sir. Professor Dershowitz, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.